Hi, my name is Leandro Facchinetti, and in this video we are going to review a code base for a project I wrote called obs-cli. It is a command line interface for OBS. You can control OBS from the command line using this. It is written in JavaScript, so you may be interested in this video for two different reasons. Maybe you are using obs-cli either standalone by itself to do something else, or because you are using the Reaper extension to record videos through OBS, which is dependent on this project. There is another video in this channel in which I reviewed the Reaper part of that project, the rescript, which is written in Lua. In this video, we are going to talk about the command line interface that is written in JavaScript. And the second reason why you may be interested in this is because you are interested in how to write a command line program for some JavaScript that you have, or just how to write a command line program in JavaScript at all, if you're interested in doing that. So I'll also discuss things like why you would want to use JavaScript for this task, why it's a good idea or a bad idea, depending on your needs. So we'll cover all that. Let's get started by, first of all, looking at the page. This is the project. You can go to this URL, which will be linked below, to download and give it a try. And I'm going to talk about the code base, but before I even get started with the code, I want to talk about the reasons why I had the project set up this way. So let's talk about the language first. The idea here is that I would be able to distribute this as a standalone executable. You may not even have Node.js installed on your machine. You may not even know what Node.js is all about, and still you want to be able to use this thing because it was originally designed so that I could do this Reaper OBS bridge. And many Reaper users may not be programmers. They may not have Node.js installed on their machines, and yet I decided to use Node.js for this project. The reason for that is that I want people to be able to contribute as easily as possible, and JavaScript is the most popular language these days. So I think that from a technical standpoint, probably other languages would be better. Probably something like Go would be a better language to do this with. In fact, there is another project called obs-cli that is written in Go, and I think it's a better fit for this space from a technical perspective because you have a binary that you can distribute. It's a single executable. People can just ship and people will download and run, it will work. And even better, you can cross-compile. So you can, from your macOS machine, or from your Windows machine, or from your Linux machine, you can compile to all these different platforms, including different architectures like 32 bits versus 64 bits, and ARM for the new Macs. So you can do all that from the same development machine using Go. That's a huge plus to Go. So if I was doing this only from a technical, if I was making this decision only from a technical perspective, I would have gone with Go. But yet here we are doing this in JavaScript. Well, I have a couple of reasons why I want to do this. I want people to be able to contribute, and JavaScript is the most popular language these days. But it's not only that. It's also that with JavaScript, I can use awesome libraries that already exist. In fact, there is already a library to work with OBS WebSockets from within JavaScript. It's this library, so I could just use the library. In fact, obs-cli is just a thin wrapper around this library. It's just a command line interface to be able to call this other library. And it doesn't hurt that I already do JavaScript for other things, so I'm already familiar with the tools, the language, the ecosystem, how to distribute things. So yeah, there is also that factor of convenience. I'm already in that community. But I think there are good reasons to do things in JavaScript, even if you're not necessarily involved in the language. All these other reasons I mentioned. One more thing, I could have done this in TypeScript, but I didn't. All my other projects, or at least most of them, are in TypeScript, but this one is JavaScript only. That's for simplicity, because I'm not exporting this in any way. This is not something that you can import into your project and use it. It's literally just a command line interface around this other library that already exists. So I didn't see much of a point in having the types there. They would maybe help tighten things up, but not by a huge amount. And it's a hassle to have to compile the TypeScript in order to distribute things. And it's yet another thing that people need to understand if they want to contribute to the project. So I thought it would be easier in this case, because it's only a command line interface, to do it in JavaScript, pure JavaScript, no TypeScript, no other languages. The whole implementation here is on this file. So let's jump right into that file and see what's going on there. So I am using libraries to do the command line parsing, because this is a command. If you don't know the tool, I think it's just a good idea for me to show you how it's used. So you can call obs-cli with a command, and this command is going to do something on OBS, which is a tool for recording videos. I guess at this point you already know this. I'm recording this video using OBS right now. So for instance, in this case, it gets a certain setting in OBS that is your current recording folder. And you can also do things like set recording folders, or start recording, or stop recording. In fact, here is a list of, this will be linked in the description below as well if you are interested, but this is a huge list of all the things you can do. So you can start recording, stop recording, you can do almost everything that you can do in OBS through this interface. And this is how you call it. You call it with obs-cli, and then the commands and the arguments to the commands. And you can pass multiple commands if you are interested. So to do all this command line parameter parsing, I'm using this library called Commander. There are many libraries to do this. Why did I choose Commander? Because it's the most popular. So the way I did this is I went to NPM trends and I looked at all the alternatives like Commander and Yargs, and it's even suggesting some. And you can see that Commander is the most popular, not by a huge margin, but it's the most popular. And why Commander, and why do I go with the most popular? It's not something that I always do, but it's something that I consider. The popularity of a library represents how well, it's one indication of the quality, how well maintained it is, how popular it is. It's also an indication of how many people know how to use it, so they will already be familiar if they want to contribute something in the project. So it's sometimes not the only thing that I consider, so it's not the only thing I look at. But in some cases like this one, I think that going with the most popular pays off. In some cases, the thing is the most popular just because it has been around longer. It's not necessarily the best. So I also go to the repositories, and I also look at the number of stars for a way of gauging the popularity, which is a metric that I care about, because I want people to be familiar with the tools and I want people to contribute. So I want to be in a space where people already are. And I always one other thing I always do is go to the repositories and look at the documentation and whatnot. In this case, I think the Commander is not perfect, but it's good enough. So that's what I'm using to do the command line parsing, as you are about to see here. Then I'm using the library. I said that this obs-cli is just a thin wrapper around this other library. It is, as far as I can tell, the only library doing this in this space, but it's also such a simple thing, and it's a good library, so there is no reason to go with any other one. And I'm doing here a trick to get the version of the package so that I can show this on the command line. So if I'm going to run this now, so I can say node index.js version, and it's going to show me the version of the library, and it's going to pick that up from the package JSON. So one thing that you may not know about JavaScript is that you can require JSON. So yes, you can require JavaScript, but you can also require JSON. And if you do that, the thing that is returned is just literally this JSON as an object. And in this case, I already have here the version in package.json, so I can just grab that and show that to the user down here. So I can increment this version and it will be picked up by this script as well. And it's a way to keep everything in sync. So yeah, let's start with the command line parsing. Most of the program is going to be command line parsing and then calling the library. So in terms of command line parsing, I have some options here. Most people are never going to need this, but if you want to control OBS that is running on another machine, then you can pass an address. And if you are running OBS with a password, when you install OBS WebSocket, which is something you have to do to use this library, you have to install OBS and OBS WebSocket. Then, let me talk about this whole infrastructure for a moment. So there is OBS CLI, that is a command line tool that is dependent on OBS WebSocket JS, which is a JavaScript library that communicates with OBS WebSocket, which is an extension for OBS. So that's how it goes. OBS CLI talks to OBS WebSocket JS, which talks to OBS WebSocket, which then talks to OBS itself. So you can, from your machine, control OBS on another machine through the network using this parameter. Most people are never going to need this. So the default is just the default in OBS WebSocket JS as well. As you can see in their documentation, there is a default for localhost 4444, which is the default port in which the OBS WebSocket extension runs when you install it in OBS. And using a commander, you can pass the options here using this syntax that is just a string, but it's the shorthand for an option, then the long form for the option. And then if the option accepts a parameter, then you pass the parameter name here, and that will be showed. This will show to the user when they go to help. So the description here will show up here, and it's also going to be available here as well when you're running the action associated with this command. Then the value will be there for you. Okay, so that's just how you use Commander. And then there is another option for a password, and by default, there is no password if you don't change the settings in OBS, as explained here. There will be no password, but you can protect this with a password if you're on a network that you don't necessarily trust and you don't want other people to be able to control your OBS via the network. And then there is this other thing here that is a feature more or less specifically designed for the use case of OBS CLI being used in the Reaper bridge to OBS. So I have this other tool, as I mentioned, that lets you record video in Reaper. And I was writing that in ReScript, which is written in Lua, the Lua programming language. And there was no way for me to parse JSON. So this tool is going to produce JSON. OBS CLI is going to produce JSON. There was no way for me to parse JSON. No easy way for me to parse JSON from within a ReScript. If I just imported some Lua libraries and whatnot, I could have done it. But it was easier for me to just here. I already have an object here in OBS CLI. It was easier for me to just project the field that I care about here. So when doing OBS Reaper, the bridge in Lua, I can call this OBS CLI and I can tell it to just return the field that I care about. So for instance, before I have, I have not actually shown this. So I can run a command for getting the streaming status, for instance. So let's do that. Get streaming status. As I said, I am recording this in OBS. So this should have given me a result. Oh, the name of the file is wrong. So yeah, this is now returning JSON. That is the current recording time for this video. So I can do the field parameter, and I can tell it that, well, as I said, you can run multiple commands. So this is going to return a list of the results of all the commands. I want the first one, and it's 0 indexed as arrays are in JavaScript. And then I can do that, and it's only going to return now the object for that. I can also do this, and now it's going to project this particular field. So I can do like rec timecode. And now it's only going to return me this. And I needed something similar to that in the Lua script. So I needed to grab just one field. And that's why you have this field option here to project that. It's not something that most people are going to need, but I needed it, so I added it. And then arguments, that is just all the commands you want to run. So this is a weird syntax to write in. Let's explain what's going on here. So the brackets mean I want this. I need at least one of these. It's a required parameter. If I try to run without this, if I don't give any commands, then that will be an error. It's missing at least one of these arguments. And then there is the request itself. So like I showed you before, get streaming status is an example of this. It's the request. And then the square brackets mean I want these arguments, but they are optional. So these angle brackets mean this is required. Square brackets mean this is optional. And then equals, that's just literally the equal sign. And then arguments, which is a JSON object. And you can see an example of that here in the usage. For instance, right here, when I'm setting the recording folder, I say what the action name is, and then an equal sign, and then some JSON that is the arguments that I'm passing to this request. And then finally, there is the body of the program itself. So in Commander, you can pass an action. The action is going to receive as arguments the arguments from here, and then as optional arguments, these ones from there as well. That's just the interface from Commander. That's how Commander works. So now I need to create this list of commands that I'm going to issue. So that's what's going to happen here. Then I'm going to connect to OBS and run the commands. And then I'm going to optionally filter out the fields that I need. As I showed you before, I can filter the fields from the response. Then I'm going to show that response. And if anything goes wrong, that's what's going to happen. And then, yeah, we have this part as well. That is just showing the version and then kicking off the whole process. So let's go through each of these sections in turn. This one is going to parse. So yes, I have a command line parser, but I have to parse this part that is a request and then an optional equal sign and then a bunch of arguments. I need to parse this. I wish I could have done this some other way, and I try to work with even other parsing libraries like Yargs and Minimist to figure this out, but none of them had this feature. I wanted to be able to just say request and then space and then the arguments. I guess that could have been easier. So instead of this, we would have something like that. The problem is there was no way for me to say, I guess it's a fair thing, there was no way for me to say that I wanted multiple requests and the arguments were optional. How would that work out? How do you know if this is another request or if it's an argument? Then you would need to look at something like, does it start with a bracket? If so, then it's probably an argument, but that was kind of fragile. So I thought it would be better to just have it this way. But because I have it this way, now I have the request and the arguments all in one command line parameter. So if I have something like what I showed you before, like set recording folder, this whole thing that I selected is just one command line parameter. It's just one of the elements here in the request strings array. And I need to tease these apart. I need to get the request and the arguments separately. That's what this block is going to do. So yeah, I have a try-catch around the whole program because many things may go wrong. And I think that the thing that will go wrong most of the time is parsing the JSON. If you have something that doesn't make sense, that is not JSON, here as an argument, that will fail. And then connecting to OBS and running commands may also fail because OBS may not be running, or you may not have installed OBS WebSockets, or it may be on a different port, or the command that you're trying to run doesn't make sense, like you're trying to stop a recording, but a recording is not going on. So all of that can go wrong. And I don't expect this to ever go wrong at all. But, oh yeah, it can go wrong if you're trying to project a field that doesn't exist. So yeah, there are many things that may go wrong. There is a whole try-catch around the whole program. Now, what's happening here is the parsing of the teasing apart of the requests. So I'm going to look at each of the request strings, which is an array. It has not been declared as an array here because this is JavaScript, not TypeScript. If this was TypeScript, I would probably have done something like this. So it's an array of strings. Each one of these is what I'm calling a request. And I'm looking for the equal sign. Index of is going to return me as a number the first index in which this character appears. If the character doesn't appear in this string at all, then it returns -1. So index is going to be a number. If the thing is -1, then it means that there is no equals sign, so the whole thing is just a request. There are no arguments, no optional arguments here. In that case, I have a requests array here going on. I'm just going to push this request in there. And you can see that I'm pushing it as a list. The reason for that will become apparent when we see how I'm doing the sending of the arguments to OBS. For now, the idea here is just that I have a list of a request and optionally its arguments on the second element of the list. And the reason why I'm doing that is so that when I do the actual call to the library that is communicating with OBS, I can just say that these are the arguments for that call. You can pretend that I'm doing the call here, in fact. You could pretend that I'm doing the requests call right here. But I'm not, because if there is some problem with your JSON, then if there is some problem with your JSON, I don't even want to try to run any commands at all. I just want to fail right away because you're issuing a command that doesn't make sense. You probably want to fix your command before you do anything that affects your OBS state. So I'm doing the parsing of the parameters before I do any connection to OBS at all. So I'm doing a sanity check on your commands first. So, of course, if you can find the index, then I'm going to slice that request that is a string. It's one of these strings. So now the index is of this equals sign right here, the first one. If there are equal signs here in the middle of the arguments, in the middle of the parameters here, they will be ignored. These equal signs are part of the JSON. I'm just looking at the first one, and I'm going to slice and get this chunk and get this chunk. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm slicing, getting from 0 to up to index, and then slicing again from index +1 to ignore the equal sign itself, and then moving onwards to the end of the string, which is the default behavior of slice. And then I'm also parsing the JSON that is coming from this part. So now here in the requests array, I have it. So request is an array, and each position, each element in the array is itself an array with the arguments I need to pass when calling OBS. So if I don't have any extra of arguments like so, then I'm just pushing the request itself. Otherwise, I'm pushing the request and the arguments in a list onto the requests array. So by the end of this loop, the requests array has clean versions of everything I need to pass when calling OBS. I'm ready to start issuing the requests and gathering the responses. So the strategy here is similar. I'm going to have an array of responses, and I'm going to be pushing onto that array. I also need to establish a connection to OBS. And you can see that OBS here has been declared as a let variable over there. Why is that? Well, because I also needed, I thought I would need it elsewhere, but I don't think I do. Oh, look at that. So I guess this can be rewritten as this. At some point in the past, this was being used here as well, in the catch block. But that's no longer the case. So that is a better way of writing this. Oh, there we go. So the first thing I do is establish a connection to OBS. And that's what's happening right here with the address and password that were passed by the user. And I was, again, just to reiterate, I was creating this address and password with defaults that match the defaults of the OBS WebSocket library itself, which I think is a nice touch. So I'm awaiting for the connection. You can see that the whole thing is asynchronous. So that's why this whole action is asynchronous. That's why I'm calling parse async right here. And you know what? I just made a change to the code. Since we made one change here, I am doing this code review and improving the code a little bit as I go. This async thing will be asynchronous. This parse async will be asynchronous because it's calling an asynchronous function. So there is no other way, right? And I did not wait for that asynchronous function to finish, that parse async to finish. And that's fine because it was the top level program, so it doesn't really matter. But because I am improving programs, I think it's a nice touch. I think it's a nice way to represent what's going on if I actually await on that. Not that it matters, because as I said, it was the only statement in the program, so it would wait until the thing finished anyway before exiting. But it's nice to have it this way, and if you had some other things after this line, it would wait for this one to finish before it started the other things. So there you go. And to do that, I would like to have a await at the top level of the program, but that's not a thing that exists for now. It's actually technically supported by Node.js at this point, this thing called top level await. But in fact, if you try to use it, and I tried, then you are forced into not using require anymore. You are forced into using import. So you're forced into turning your module into an ECMAScript module. So you have to rewrite things like this. And there is nothing wrong with that. That's the future. That's where the community is going to go. But many tools are not working with this yet, because while the import itself, the ECMAScript modules itself is stable now in Node.js, many of the tools around that in Node.js are not stable. And then there are third-party tools like Jest and TS Node and so on that currently don't support, or you have to enable some experimental flags in order to support that kind of ECMAScript module in Node.js. So for the time being, the best way to work with top-level await is to have this preamble that is an asynchronous function that you declare here. I'm going to collapse this part so you can see how it works. So the whole body of the program is now within this async thing. So you declare an asynchronous function and immediately call it. It's something called an immediately invoked function expression or something like that. So now that you are in a synchronous function, you can call await. And as I said, the program is going to wait until all the callbacks are finished before it exits. So it doesn't really make a difference to have it this way, but I think it communicates better the intent that we should be awaiting for this program to execute, the action to execute, for this parse async to finish. Okay, coming back. We establish an OBS connection then for each one of the requests that we gather before we go and actually send the request. And that is all asynchronous, connecting, sending requests, disconnecting, all those actions will be asynchronous. That's why, that's the only reason why this function had to be asynchronous, and that's the only reason why we had to have this as asynchronous, and that's why we have to have this await as well. It's all because of this. And it makes sense, because when you're connecting to OBS, you're going to the network. It may be on localhost, but you're going to the network. It could be slow. It doesn't really make a difference in this command line program. It could all be synchronous in this case. But if you were connecting on a browser, if you were connecting to OBS from within the browser, which is something you can do with this library, or if you're running this as part of Express server, for instance, you're doing an HTTP server with Node.js, then it makes sense to have this await because you don't want to block the whole execution of JavaScript. Anyway, so it's sending the requests, and as I said, it is using the array. So requests is an array of arrays, and each one of these arrays contains a list of arguments to pass to OBS send. So the argument may be just the request, or the argument may be the request and some arguments. So the way I'm taking this array and saying that, no, it's not an array, it's a list of options, is by doing this. It's splicing the array as a list of options. And that's, I guess, another reason why I'm not using TypeScript, because this is a kind of trick that TypeScript isn't happy with. You would have to be explicit here, and they structure the array and pass the array explicitly here as a list of arguments. So you would have to do something like this. So each one of the requests is actually a request and some arguments. So we would have to do something like request and arguments. That's the kind of thing you would have to do to make TypeScript happy. But I'm not doing TypeScript, so that's what we have. Okay, so I run all the commands and I push the responses into the responses array. The responses are going to be JSON. They're going to be objects. And then I disconnect after I am done. And you can see that I'm doing all these in series. I'm awaiting before I do the next command. And that's because sometimes one of the commands depends on the next. When I'm doing the Reaper OBS bridge, I actually do that. I do a get recording folder, and then I do a set recording folder. So I want the get recording folder to be first, and I want it to be done before I set the recording folder. And that's because I want to get the original recording folder, because I'm going to change it, and then later I want to change it back. So I need to do a get and then a set. Okay, so now I have these responses. Now I need to gather the output that I actually want to give to the user. So initially the output is the list of responses. But if I have defined that field option, then I'm going to want to project some of the fields out of this output. That's what's going to happen here. So the field parts, they are like something like this. This is the parameter itself. So similar to what we did here, where we had to split or tease apart the set recording folder from the arguments, for instance. So we had to do something like this here. We also have to do something like that here as well, because field is an argument that contains all the projections you want to make. And I have to split this, but this is easier. I just have to split it on the dot, because these never have a dot in them. So I know that all the fields are separated by dots. That's just a syntax I made up. So if field is undefined, then you don't want to do any projections. But if you have a field, then you're going to split on the dot. If you don't have any dots, for instance, in this case, we didn't have any dots, then this is going to split on the dot, which means just return a list containing the 0 in this case. I'll show you. So if I have just a 0 and I split it on the dot, then I get back a list with just the number 0. In the end, field parts is going to be a list of projections you want to make. Each one of these lists is a field part. And first of all, I want to check, am I even trying to project from an object? This is a clever trick, because object here in this case may be a list. Initially, it's a list. So if I don't do any projections, like this, then this is a list. But in JavaScript, a list or an array is an object. It's type of object. So you can do something like type of, and you can see that it's an object. And also, if I have something like a literal object, it's also an object. So in essence, what I'm saying here is, does it even make sense for me to try to project a field out of this? Is it a list or is it an object? Because you may have reached a point where it's actually a string. That is the case on the projection of the rec timecode thing we did before. So if we did something like this, at this point, that field is a string. It's already this number right here. So it's a string. It doesn't make sense to try to project a field out of a string. And that's where you have this error popping up. But if it does make sense to try to project something out of that, then I am going to project it. But if I did not find anything, then I throw an error as well. So that is in the case that the output doesn't even have that field that you're trying to project. So you throw an error there as well. And you're doing that on a loop for each of the field parts. So when I have something like this, it's first going to get the 0th element in this list. So it's going to get this object, and then it's going to try to project rect timecode. So it's going to project this. And then it's going to have a string. And why do I even bother with this at that point? Because you could try to project fields out of the string, right? You could project things like, I guess, length. And that could kind of work because you would get the length of the string. But I decided not to go with that. I decided that was too much magic. So I make sure that I have an object or an array that is an object in AdSense before I even try to project anything. So anyway, after this loop is done, I have projected all the fields in the loop. I have gone through the loop many times, projecting the fields as deep as you can go. And I guess all the response objects in OBS WebSocket.js, they are all plain objects containing just primitives like strings and booleans and maybe numbers. I don't think that they contain other objects in them. And I think that's just the responses that you get from OBS WebSocket. But even if you had deeply nested objects with deeply nested lists in them, it doesn't really matter. You could, with this strategy, project them out. So this strategy is general enough to do that. Cool stuff. I guess there are libraries like Lodash that have utilities to do something like this. I haven't looked up. I know that this will work just fine. And now finally, I'm going to output this to the user on the console. So console log, and then I check, do I have a string? Because if I do, I'm just going to output that string. So maybe you projected some field like we did before. I forget where, but we did before where we were projecting the rect time. Well, I can just rerun this. So this, oh yeah, it was right here. So this is just a string. I want to show that as a plain string because it makes things easier for the other Lua script I was working with if you just output this string. But if you have something like a list or an object, then I want to turn that into JSON. So JSON stringify the output. And then there is this, so it's going to convert the object into JSON again. So it's going to turn into a string. And I want that to be pretty printed. I want that to look nice like this, instead of looking like just one long line. So I can pass here these extra arguments undefined because this could be something to transform fields, a function to transform fields. I don't need to transform any fields in the JSON. So I could, for instance, rename things on the way out, like preview only could be turned into preview or something. You could change the object on the way out when it's being turned into a string, but I don't need any of that, so I pass undefined. And then the number of spaces with which to indent. So you can see that there are 2 spaces here and then 2 plus 2 spaces there. So it's indenting with 2 spaces. That's what's going on here. And that's the output. If any of the errors that I mentioned before occurred, maybe this error, maybe this ran into an error, whatever else, or maybe this ran into an error. Whatever the problem may be, I check. Is this an instance of error? Then show a message. So show the error message. And that's the case where I'm doing something like this, right? I'm throwing an error. But I don't remember this, but I believe that OBS send, if it runs into an error, it doesn't return an instance of error because you can throw anything, right? Usually you throw an error and you give it a message, like something went wrong. For instance, the spelling of something. So usually you do something like this, but you can throw anything. You can throw the number. You can throw a number if you want. So I check, is it an error? If so, show the message. If not, then just do exactly the same thing we did here, right? We just output a prettier version of this, which I think will be an object, and that's what OBS returns. The OBS WebSocket.js is going to return this object as the error. I don't know. Let's see. I guess one way to make that cause an error is to do something like I don't exist. Yeah. So there you go. It returns an object, and I'm printing that object more beautifully as JSON like that. And then if that ran into an error, I also say process exit with 1 because I want that process to signal failure. So any program that runs, like let's say I'm listing the directory, if that ran successfully, it returns 0. If something runs unsuccessfully, like before, it returns a code that is greater than 0. And that's how you know that something was an error. And that's all of the JavaScript. Now let's talk about the other things that have to do with distribution of this JavaScript. I want people to be able to use this as an executable. And I don't want people to necessarily need to have Node installed or even know what Node is all about. I used JavaScript and Node.js because I wanted other developers to be able to easily contribute. And because I knew it already. And because it had this cool library that already did most of the work. But I did not want people to necessarily have to have Node installed. So what's going on there? Well, I'm using this tool called package that turns your JavaScript into an executable. And this is an example of package being used. So I guess I can just run build, and it's going to package, and we can see the outputs. So what package is going to do is create these executables. You can see that they are, you can even cross-compile to different platforms. And they are just things that you can run without even needing Node installed because they embed Node in the executable itself. So I can do something like package obs-cli macOS. And it may seem like I am running Node because I have Node installed, or it may seem that I'm using the Node installation that I have here, but actually no, it's this thing here being packaged is actually running from a Node.js instance within this executable. It's a standalone thing that you can transfer to another machine and just run there. And I needed this for the Reaper OBS bridge. Package is good, but it's not perfect. It hasn't been maintained for a while, it seems. It has some bugs. I fixed some of them, but there are still more bugs. And cross-compilation doesn't really work if you have native modules, which is not the case here, but it's the case in many projects. So it's riddled with problems. Package is great, but it's riddled with problems. It's also the most popular package in this space. There are many other packages for compiling and producing binaries. Most of them have problems. I came up with my own, and I'm going to do another video and talk about this in another instance. It's not being used here because I created that other thing yesterday evening, but I think I will migrate to that other thing, and it will be better in many ways. Anyway, subscribe to the channel and stick around to learn more about this in the near future. Or if you're watching this in the future, you may just look around and you may find a video about this other package as well. It's called Kasha. Anyway, it will be called Kasha because I'm still working on it. So yeah, it is creating packages for binaries that I can just distribute. And people don't need Node installed. They don't need to know that this was written in JavaScript. There is a problem with this simple command line tool that is, I don't know, 50 lines of code, 72 lines of code. I mean, look at the size of the files. Most people don't care. It's fine. But still, 70 megabytes. I think that's bigger than Reaper. I'm sure it's bigger than Reaper. It's about the same size as OBS itself. It is ridiculous. But it's a trade-off, right? It includes the whole Node.js thing. It's a lot. Cache will make smaller binaries. They will be around 30 megabytes. It's not great, but it's better. Anyway, so I have that. I will also talk about some other things going on here in package.json. So I have the description, that's boring, version, name, and whatnot. I have some scripts. So one is checking the styles with Prettier. It's checking that index.js is following the coding convention. So if I have something like this, the indentation is wrong, that tests will fail. That's the only test they have, actually. The only thing I'm testing for is styles. I don't have proper unit tests for this because I didn't think it made sense. It's a command line tool wrapping around a library that I suppose has been tested. I tested it by hand by using it, but I suppose it has unit tests in there somewhere. I don't know. This is the source for it. And yes, there are some tests there, I suppose. I don't know. I don't care. It's a simple library, really, that one. This library is super simple as well. It's just wrapping around a WebSocket and calling the thing. So I suppose it works. Anyway, so the only test I have is for styles. And I'm writing this in an unusual way. Usually I would write it like this, but that doesn't work in Windows. So that's why I'm doing it this way. And I also have to pass this so it considers end of lines to be whatever is on the file. I'm doing this in macOS, so end of lines are new lines like this. In other operating systems like Windows, it would be something like that. So Prettier would freak out, but by passing this command line flag, Prettier behaves. And then some keywords, all that. Then I have this because when I am producing a binary using package, but also distributing through NPM, as we are about to see, it looks at this field to know what the name of the binary should be. Oh, and this is actually unnecessary because obs-cli is also the name of the package, so this can be simpler. It can look like this. And then repository, it's on GitHub, so I don't need to say HTTPS, GitHub, blah, blah, blah. Dependencies, Commander and OBS WebSocket.js, as we saw. This is just for testing and this is just for packaging, so they are declared as dev dependencies. And that's all that's going on here. Now for the real trick, the final trick, let's go to the GitHub actions. These are going to run every time I push, and they're going to not run tests, really. It's just going to run Prettier, but it's going to run the tests. And it's going to build the binaries for distribution. That's the huge thing. It's going to use package to build the binaries to distribute to the different operating systems, and it's going to upload so that I can just tell people, yeah, the way you install this, if you don't want to think about it, is just download the executable from of the GitHub releases for this project. The binaries are there, as you can see, created by the GitHub action. Of course, if you don't want to do it this way, we are also going to see that in this GitHub action, I am also using NPM, so you can install using npx. You don't actually need to install it. npx is going to get that for you. Or you can literally just install with npm install. That's going to work as well. So it is available in npm. You can download it from there if you have Node in your machine already and you don't want to have a binary that is just somewhere floating around, not even versioned, and that includes the whole Node.js. Again, you already have that in your machine. It's easier to just install it using Node or using npm. But if you don't, then you have the binary right there. So I'm going to distribute the binaries actually in two different ways. I'm going to distribute the binaries as literal binaries, but also as tar-gzs. I'll talk about tarballs. I'll talk about why that's necessary. Okay, so let's jump into this configuration and see everything that's going on here. Okay, so I'm running this every time I push. There is only one job that's called main, and it's going to run on Ubuntu. And it's going to take all these steps. I guess I have lied because there are some things that I did not put in here yet. They will be here in the future. we'll get there. Anyway, first action is to check out the code. That's something that exists in every GitHub action that runs on push, I think, because I need the code to do anything. Then I'm going to set up Node with the latest version, and I need to pass it the registry URL because I will distribute this to NPM, as I said. We'll see how that works in 2 lines. And I'm going to run the tests. This is a cool npm command that installs using your package.lock. Because when you say just npm install, you may be adding a new dependency like npm install express. I don't know, something like that. But in this case, I don't want to install new dependencies. I don't want to change anything in package.lock. I don't want to do any of those things. So I'm using install CI that respects package.lock entirely and doesn't try to change or add any new dependency. And then this command also runs the tests right after. As I said, the tests are just running prettier, but they're there. Then the next action is only going to run if I am on a tag, because I only want to publish to npm and create a new GitHub release if I am on a tag. So that's why this if right here. So what's going to happen here is going to run that other script to run build. So it's going to run this part that runs package. And then npm publish, which gets so run build will do, in this case, only packaging. It's not strictly necessary for publishing. But in many other of my projects, I have a line like this because it also compiles TypeScript to JavaScript. And then I don't want to publish, I don't want npm publish the contents of the package directory, but I very much want to publish the compiled JavaScript. So that's why I have this line written like so, because it's the same line I have in other projects. And because I am publishing, I need this environment variable. It's something that you can find here in the documentation for this action. So anytime you see an action like this uses in a GitHub action description like this, you can always say github.com/that name and you go to that action. You can see somewhere in here, there is something like this telling you how to publish things. So you have to say what is the registry URL, and you have to say what is your token to be able to publish there. And of course, in your repository, you have to go to settings, and this is the private part of your repository that no one can see, but you can go to secrets and you can add your npm token as a secret. It will be available in your actions like that. And then publish will just work. It will publish the package to npm with the new tag. And then, by the way, since I'm talking about tags, I want to show you another cool npm command. It's called npm version. And then you can say things like patch or minor or major. And it's going to do a bunch of things. It's going to increment your version in package.json. And my script will also pick that up, which is sort of cool. It will create a new commit. It will create a tag. So you can just say npm version patch and git push tags, and just for good measure, git push origin master. But with this command, I can release a new version. In fact, I'm going to leave this command here, and I will do that in the end of the video. Since we made small changes to the project, I'm going to do that and release a new version live. Won't that be fun? So right next, I'm going to create a release if I am on a tag. So that's going to create one of these releases. And I need a GitHub token. I don't need to set this up on the secrets. It's always there when you're running a GitHub action. And you need to say what the tag and release names are. I'm going to get this from the reference, which, as we saw before, is a tag with a version. So this only runs if this is a tag with a version. It starts with a V. And that's a convention that npm version, the executable here, will also follow this convention and produce tags this way. So this is going to create a release. And I give this step, as you can see, all these are steps. I give this step an ID because I will refer to this step later to grab the executables and publish them in the right place. So now I'm using this upload release asset 3 times, one for each of the assets I need to publish, and they are the Windows, Linux, and macOS versions of the executable. So I only run this action. I run it 3 times, but I only run them if I am on a tag. And then I pass the GitHub token, which is always available, always the same. And the upload URL is always the same as well. It's grabbing the URL from the step called create release. It has some outputs, one of which, I guess the only one, is the upload URL. So that's how I'm wiring the creation of the release with the publishing of the assets in the release. And then I need to pass different, and these are different. So I need to pass the different executables that I want to upload with different names. So the path in my current directory, and as you can see, it generates a configured package to produce packages in the package directory. So they are there. And they are in the package directory, but they have different names. Then there is the asset name. That's the name that is going to show up in the GitHub release. So when you go to the GitHub release, these are the names. And then the asset content type. And for binaries in macOS and Linux, there is only this octet stream, which is like the type that is, it means I don't know which type this is effectively. That's what this is. Octet is just a bit, and stream is, it's a stream of bits. It's pretty generic. But for executables on Windows, there is this type that is a vendor Microsoft portable executable. It's a EXE. So that's the type of your asset, which I think is the type that is passed to the browser when you try to download this. So GitHub provides that content type when the browser and the server, the GitHub server, are negotiating the content and what to do with it. Do I show a download dialog in the browser? Do I just try to show it to the user as text on the screen? So when doing that, it takes in account this asset content type. So yeah, I was kind of lying before. I'm not distributing tarballs from this. I think I will in the future, but because I think that tarballs have advantages. Like if you just download this from GitHub, you still have to change the mode of the file. You have to do something like chmod +X, and then whatever you have this asset, because it doesn't keep the mode when you upload to GitHub and then download back. So a tarball would be nice because it would be smaller and it would keep the mode right. But I don't have that yet. I think I will in the future. Come back to this repository in the future to see this. Okay, so let's do the thing I promised. Let's create a release here live. So the things I changed are just this. I made that simpler. And here I also made this more explicit. I made this simpler by throwing it there. And those are all the changes. That's pretty minor. I'm not even going to bother with a commit message. And so as I said, git version is going to create a tag for me and update the version in package.json. So let's look at the current version is 2.2.2. That's the one that is published at GitHub as well. So now I'm going to run this to create a new 2.2.3, push the tags, push to origin master, and I'm running that. And as you can see, it already created 2.2.3. It has created here in my Git history. You can see that there is now a new commit. It has a commit message this time. And it has a tag. It has published everything to GitHub. And now let's go to GitHub and refresh the page. We can see that there is a new commit going on. There are some actions going on here as well. One for master that was pushed, but also the more important one for this tag. We can jump into that and see it running live. So the tests have already run. This is now building the packages and publishing them to npm. We can see that it's now on npm. So I will go here to the README real quick, so I can grab a link to npm. So 2.2.3 should be on npm any second now. It's right there. It has been published a few seconds ago. And it also created the release and put all the assets there. So I can come here to the README and jump to releases. There is now a 223 release with the assets for all the different operating systems. And that's how you distribute a package in just one command. Anyway, I hope you liked this video. I hope you learned something about Node.js, how to build packages that are executable in different operating systems, how to distribute them, GitHub Actions, some stuff about OBS as well. Why not? That's always fun. Thanks for watching. I hope you subscribe to the channel if you're interested in this kind of coding deep dives and more Reaper stuff and fun stuff with OBS and recording and audio techniques and whatnot. I talk about a whole lot of things. Anyway, thanks for watching. I see you on the next one. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, contribute on Patreon if you are into that, contribute on PayPal if you want to do a one-time thing. I hope this helps. I see you on the next one. Bye.